3 nuns, operating under the guise of divine authority, systematically tortured and murdered 67 women and children at what was supposed to be a sanctuary for the desperate. The state's main archives contained a survivor's testimony so disturbing that authorities refused to make it public for over a century. Tonight we reveal what really happened behind the walls of St. Catherine's House of Mercy. Before we continue with the story of St. Catherine's House of Mercy, this channel is not for everyone, only for the most combustible souls who dare to unravel the darkest chapters of American history. If you dare to hear what really happened in the shadows of our past, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments which state you're listening from. Are you brave enough to join our community of true mystery hunters? Let's find out together. What makes this story particularly chilling is that it was not motivated by religious fanaticism or supernatural forces, but by something much more terrifying: the calculated pursuit of control and sadistic pleasure hidden behind a facade of Christian charity and divine punishment. In the winter of 1894, desperate families across Illinois sent their most vulnerable members to what they believed was a house of God. Orphaned children, unmarried mothers, and women deemed mentally unstable were promised care, rehabilitation, and salvation. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare where scripture was twisted to justify unspeakable cruelty. The 3 women who ran this house of horrors wore traditional habits and spoke of God's will, but their true nature was far from holy. What began as an investigation into mysterious disappearances would uncover one of the most disturbing cases of systematic abuse in American history. But what the authorities didn't know in 1894 was that St. Catherine's House of Mercy wasn't just another case of religious extremism gone wrong. The truth was far more sinister. The investigation began when Margaret Holloway, a seamstress from Chicago, arrived at the county sheriff's office in January 1895. She was searching for her 16-year-old daughter Emma, who had been sent to St. Catherine's 6 months earlier. Margaret had received no letters, no updates, nothing. When she traveled to the house to check on Emma personally, the nuns told her that her daughter had died of fever and been buried in the church cemetery. But there was no grave, no record of death, no body. Margaret wasn't the only one searching for missing family members. Over the following weeks, 7 more families came forward with identical stories. Children and women sent to St. Catherine's had simply vanished. The nuns provided different excuses each time. Some had supposedly died of illness. Others had run away in the night. A few had been transferred to other institutions, though no one could say which ones. Sheriff Thomas Brennan decided to pay an unannounced visit to St. Catherine's House of Mercy in February 1895. What he discovered there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The house was completely empty. No nuns, no residents, no furniture, just bare rooms with stains on the wooden floors that looked suspiciously like dried blood. In the basement, Brennan found evidence of what appeared to be makeshift cells. Iron chains still hung from the stone walls. But here's the revelation that changed everything about this case. The 3 nuns who ran St. Catherine's House of Mercy were never nuns at all. Church records show that no religious order had ever operated a facility by that name in Illinois. The women who tortured and murdered 67 innocent souls had simply put on habits and created an entirely fictional religious institution. They had used society's blind trust in religious authority to lure vulnerable victims into their trap. Families handed over their most defenseless members without question, believing they were placing them in God's hands. Instead, they were delivering them to predators who had weaponized faith itself. The real question that haunts investigators to this day is this: if these women weren't motivated by twisted religious beliefs, what drove them to commit such calculated evil? And more terrifying still, the survivors' testimony that remains sealed in those state archives reportedly contains details about what these fake nuns were actually doing to their victims. What was so disturbing that the government decided the public could never know the truth? The truth about what happened in that basement would only emerge when authorities finally tracked down the lone survivor mentioned in those sealed records. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and she had escaped St. Catherine's House of Mercy 3 weeks before the sheriff's visit. Clara had been sent to the house when she was 19 years old, pregnant and unmarried. Her family believed she would receive care and guidance until the baby was born, but what she witnessed during her 4 months of captivity revealed the true horror of what those three women were doing. The fake nuns weren't just torturing their victims for sadistic pleasure. They were running a business, a very specific, very profitable business that depended on society's most vulnerable people simply disappearing without questions asked. Clara's testimony describes how the women would strip their victims of any valuables immediately upon arrival: wedding rings, family heirlooms, anything of worth. But that was just the beginning. The real money came from what happened next. Here's the bombshell revelation that changes everything about this case. The three women weren't operating St. Catherine's House of Mercy as a cover for random acts of violence. They were running a body-selling operation, harvesting organs and selling corpses to medical schools across the Midwest. The torture wasn't the end goal. It was just their twisted way of keeping victims weak and compliant before the final harvest. Clara witnessed the women negotiating prices with men in dark coats who arrived at night. She saw them preparing bodies in the basement, carefully removing organs and preserving them in jars. The chains on the walls weren't just for restraint. They were part of an efficient system designed to keep victims alive and healthy until buyers placed their orders. The fake religious facade was perfect camouflage. Who would question nuns caring for society's unwanted? Who would investigate too deeply when undesirable family members simply vanished? The women had created the perfect cover for what was essentially a human slaughterhouse disguised as a sanctuary. This explains why the state archives remain sealed even today. The investigation didn't just uncover three murderers. It exposed a network of medical schools, private collectors, and wealthy individuals who had been purchasing human remains with no questions asked. The scandal would have destroyed entire institutions and implicated some of the most respected names in Illinois society. Clara's testimony reportedly includes a detailed list of buyers, their payment methods, and specific orders they placed. She describes overhearing conversations about standing orders for children's organs, requests for specific body types, and negotiations over bulk pricing for multiple victims. But here's what terrifies investigators most about Clara's account. She mentions that before she escaped, she overheard the women discussing expansion plans. They were planning to open similar operations in other states, recruiting more accomplices to meet growing demand. The question that haunts authorities is this: how many other St. Catherine's Houses of Mercy were already operating across America by 1895? What makes this even more chilling is that the false St. Catherine's houses might still be operating today, hidden behind different facades, different lies, but serving the same horrific purpose. But there's something about Clara Whitmore's testimony that investigators missed for over a century, something that changes everything we thought we knew about this case. In 1994, exactly 100 years after the St. Catherine's massacre, a package arrived at the Illinois State Archives. No return address, no explanation. Inside was a leather-bound journal wrapped in yellowed cloth. The handwriting matched Clara Whitmore's testimony perfectly, but these pages contained information that had never been part of the official record. Clara hadn't just escaped from St. Catherine's House of Mercy. She had been deliberately released. According to her private journal, the three fake nuns had given her a specific mission before letting her go. They told her exactly what to tell the authorities, exactly how to describe their operation, and exactly which details to include in her testimony. Here's the revelation that turns everything upside down. Clara Whitmore wasn't a survivor. She was an accomplice. The entire medical school story, the organ harvesting operation, the buyer network, it was all a carefully constructed lie designed to hide something even darker. The real St. Catherine's House of Mercy was never closed down because the authorities never found the real St. Catherine's House of Mercy. While investigators were chasing shadows and sealed medical school records, the actual operation continued undisturbed in its true location. Clara's testimony was designed to send law enforcement in completely the wrong direction. The three women who disappeared weren't fleeing justice. They were relocating to continue their work, protected by the perfect cover story that Clara had planted in the official records. Every detail of her testimony was crafted to create a dead-end investigation. What Clara's secret journal reveals is that the missing 67 women and children weren't killed for their organs. They were being prepared for something far more profitable and infinitely more disturbing. The basement chains weren't for restraint during medical procedures. They were part of a conditioning process designed to create something that Clara describes as perfect servants, human beings completely stripped of will, memory, and identity. But here's the most terrifying part of Clara's confession. She writes that by 1895, the operation had already produced over 200 of these perfect servants and had buyers lined up across the country. If Clara Whitmore's secret journal is authentic, it means that for over a century, law enforcement has been protecting the very network they thought they were investigating. The sealed archives weren't hiding evidence of the crime, they were hiding evidence of the cover-up. The question that should terrify us all is this: how many of those perfect servants are still out there, and how many powerful families built their empires on the broken minds of St. Catherine's victims? But what if I told you that Clara Whitmore's journal was discovered not by accident, but because someone wanted it to be found, someone who knew exactly what secrets it contained and when the world would be ready to hear them? In 2019, 94-year-old Esperanza Silva contacted the Illinois State Archives from her nursing home in São Paulo, Brazil. She claimed to be Clara Whitmore's great-granddaughter and said she had information that would expose the final truth about St. Catherine's House of Mercy. Esperanza's story began when she was cleaning out her grandmother's belongings after the funeral in 1978. Hidden inside an old sewing kit, she found a collection of letters written in English. The letters described Clara's life after St. Catherine's, but according to Esperanza, these weren't the words of a traumatized survivor trying to rebuild her life. They were progress reports from an active agent, detailing the success of her mission and requesting new assignments. Here's the bombshell that destroys everything we thought we knew. Clara Whitmore wasn't just an accomplice to the St. Catherine's operation. She was the mastermind behind it. The 3 fake nuns were working for her, not the other way around. The entire survivor story was Clara's masterpiece of deception. She had orchestrated her own escape, planted false evidence about the medical school operation, and then disappeared into a new identity, while her subordinates relocated the real business to continue operations under her remote control. Esperanza's grandmother had kept detailed records of Clara's activities for decades after St. Catherine's. The letters describe similar operations being established in 12 different states, all reporting back to Clara's growing network. Each location used a different cover story: orphanages, women's shelters, treatment facilities, but all served the same horrific purpose. What terrifies investigators about Esperanza's revelation is the timeline. Clara's letters continue until 1954, nearly 60 years after St. Catherine's. If Clara Whitmore spent 6 decades building this network before passing control to a hand-picked successor, how many facilities are operating right now under her legacy system? But what Esperanza Silva told investigators next would shatter every assumption about Clara Whitmore's true identity and the real scope of her operation. Speaking in broken English from her nursing home bed, Esperanza revealed that her grandmother had kept one final secret hidden for over 40 years. In 1954, the same year Clara's letters stopped, Esperanza's grandmother received an unexpected visitor at her home in Chicago. It was Clara Whitmore herself, now an elderly woman of 79, arriving unannounced with a single leather suitcase and a desperate confession. She was dying of cancer and wanted to unburden herself of the truth before meeting her maker. What Clara revealed to Esperanza's grandmother would explain everything about St. Catherine's House of Mercy and the decades of horror that followed. Clara hadn't masterminded the operation at all. She had been the first victim. Here's the revelation that destroys everything we thought we knew. Clara Whitmore died in the basement of St. Catherine's House of Mercy in 1894, along with the other 66 victims. The woman who escaped, who gave testimony to authorities, who built a network of facilities across 12 states, was never Clara Whitmore at all. The real mastermind had stolen Clara's identity after torturing her for months, learning every detail of her life, her family, her mannerisms. The dying woman who confessed to Esperanza's grandmother in 1954 revealed that she was actually Sister Margaret, one of the 3 fake nuns who had run the original operation. She had used Clara's identity to disappear into society, while her 2 accomplices relocated the facility. For 60 years she had lived as Clara Whitmore, expanding the network, perfecting the techniques, and training new operators to carry on the work. The real Clara had been dead for decades. But here's what made Sister Margaret's deathbed confession so terrifying. She revealed that the identity theft wasn't unique to her. Each of the 3 fake nuns had murdered specific victims at St. Catherine's and assumed their identities upon leaving. They had all been living as their victims for 60 years, using stolen lives to build legitimate covers for their continued operations. The woman who had spent decades as Clara Whitmore told Esperanza's grandmother that somewhere in America, 2 other elderly women were also living stolen lives, still running facilities, still perfecting their methods. She had trained successors, but so had they. If Sister Margaret was telling the truth in 1954, it means that the St. Catherine's operation had been run by stolen souls for over a century. The question that should terrify us all is this: how many of the missing victims from St. Catherine's are still walking among us, wearing the faces of the dead? But Esperanza Silva wasn't finished with her revelations. As investigators prepared to leave her nursing home room, she called them back with a trembling voice. "There's something else," she whispered in heavily accented English. Esperanza's hands shook as she reached under her pillow and pulled out a faded photograph. The photograph showed 3 elderly women standing together outside what appeared to be a government building. They were well-dressed, respectable-looking, smiling at the camera, but what made investigators' blood run cold was the handwritten note on the back: "Annual reunion, Margaret as Clara, Catherine as Mrs. Davies, Mary as Doctor." My grandmother recognized one of them immediately. Esperanza continued, the woman in the middle, calling herself Mrs. Davies. She had been my grandmother's employer for over 20 years, a pillar of the community. Here's the bombshell that shatters everything we thought we understood. The 3 fake nuns from St. Catherine's hadn't just stolen random identities to disappear into obscurity. They had specifically targeted and murdered women who held positions of trust and authority in society. Clara Whitmore was chosen because she was a respected seamstress with connections to working families. Mrs. Davies ran a children's charity. Dr. Helen Ross was a prominent physician who worked with vulnerable patients. "But that's not the worst part," Esperanza whispered, her voice barely audible. "My grandmother said Mrs. Davies used to bring children to the house sometimes, children from her charity. She said they were going on special outings, educational trips, but my grandmother noticed something strange. The children who went on these trips always came back different, quieter, more obedient. The photograph wasn't just evidence of the 3 killers living stolen lives. It was proof that they had been using their assumed identities to access new victims for decades. The children's charity, the medical practice, the seamstress shop with its connections to struggling families, all of it was a feeding system for their continued operations. If these 3 women spent decades in positions of trust, systematically selecting and conditioning children through their legitimate community roles, how many generations of victims are walking among us right now, and how many are now in positions of power themselves? As Esperanza Silva's breathing became more labored, she gripped the photograph with trembling fingers and looked directly into the investigator's eyes. "There's one more thing my grandmother told me about Mrs. Davies and those children," she whispered. "My grandmother said Mrs. Davies would always bring the same children back to the house multiple times, week after week, month after month." Esperanza's voice cracked as she continued. The children weren't just becoming more obedient, they were becoming identical to each other. My grandmother started keeping a record of every child she saw Mrs. Davies bring to the house. She wrote down their names, their ages, how many times they visited. Here's the bombshell that destroys everything we thought we knew. Mrs. Davies wasn't just conditioning random children from her charity. She was systematically selecting children who looked remarkably similar to each other, and more terrifyingly, children who resembled the 3 fake nuns when they were young. The photographs my grandmother kept showed dozens of little girls who could have been sisters, all with the same facial features, the same bone structure, the same coloring. My grandmother said she was creating perfect copies of herself and her accomplices, training them from childhood to think like them, act like them, become them. The children weren't just victims. The most terrifying part is what my grandmother witnessed in 1953, just months before Mrs. Davies disappeared. She saw 3 of the older girls, now teenagers, arrive at the house wearing identical dark dresses. They moved in perfect synchronization, spoke in the same tone, even tilted their heads the same way. That's when she realized the truth about St. Catherine's House of Mercy. It had never been about killing victims or stealing identities. If Mrs. Davies successfully created teenage copies of herself and her accomplices in 1953, and if those copies have been training their own replacements for the past 70 years, how many generations of these identical predators are now walking among us, and how do we identify them when they're designed to be perfect copies of trusted community leaders? As Esperanza's eyes grew heavy, she suddenly gripped the bedrail with surprising strength. "Wait," she gasped. "There's something else about that photograph." She pointed to the 3 women in the 1953 photograph with a shaking finger. "My grandmother said she recognized all 3 of them, not just Mrs. the woman calling herself Clara Whitmore. My grandmother had seen her before 1894. She was the inspector who came to evaluate St. Catherine's House of Mercy for the state. And the 3rd woman, Dr. Helen Ross, she was the physician who signed the death certificates for the supposed victims. Here's the bombshell that shatters everything. There never were 3 fake nuns running St. Catherine's House of Mercy. The entire operation was orchestrated by 3 government officials who were already in positions of power: the state inspector who approved the facility, the doctor who falsified the death records, the charity director who provided the victims. My grandmother said she finally understood why the investigation went nowhere in 1895. The people investigating the crime were the same people who committed it. They weren't hiding from the law. She said the real St. Catherine's House of Mercy was never a rogue operation. If the people responsible for investigating missing children were the same people making them disappear, how many other official institutions are still operating today under their control, and how many families are still unknowingly delivering their children directly into their hands? But as investigators leaned closer to hear Esperanza's final words, she suddenly opened her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her memory. "My grandmother lied about everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "She wasn't just a witness to what Mrs. Vos. The day before my grandmother died in 1978, she grabbed my hand and told me the truth she had kept hidden for over 80 years. She said she recognized Mrs. Davies immediately in 1953 because they had worked together before, not as employer and housekeeper. My grandmother wasn't some innocent bystander who happened to witness the horrors. She was the 4th member of the original St. Catherine's operation. She said the 3 women in the photograph weren't just meeting for a reunion. They were meeting to decide what to do about her." Here's the bombshell that destroys everything. Esperanza Silva wasn't revealing family secrets to expose the truth about St. Catherine's House of Mercy. She was completing a mission her grandmother had started over 40 years ago. The dying confession, the hidden photographs, the detailed records, it was all part of an elaborate deception designed to misdirect investigators once again. My grandmother trained me from childhood to memorize every detail of this story, Esperanza continued, her frail voice growing stronger. She told me that the real St. Catherine's House of Mercy was never shut down because it was never meant to be found. The 3 women in that photograph weren't the masterminds. They were middle management. As Esperanza's breathing grew more labored, she smiled with a coldness that chilled the investigators to their core. "My grandmother said you would come eventually. If every survivor, every witness, every breakthrough in the St. Catherine's investigation has been a carefully planted deception, how many other cold cases are actually ongoing operations using investigators themselves as unwitting protectors of their crimes?" But as the investigators turned to leave, convinced they had been manipulated once again, Esperanza's laughter echoed through the nursing home room. It wasn't the weak chuckle of a dying woman. It was the cold, calculated laugh of someone who had just watched their plan unfold perfectly. "You still don't understand," she said, her voice suddenly clear and strong. "My grandmother didn't train me to lie to you. Every word I said was true. The 3 women in that photograph weren't just meeting in 1953 to discuss my grandmother. They were meeting because something had gone wrong with their operation. Here's the bombshell that changes everything. The real St. Catherine's House of Mercy was never shut down because it was never just one location. It was a network of facilities connected by underground tunnels that stretched across 3 states. Every investigation, every false lead, every misdirection was designed to keep authorities focused on individual buildings, while the real operation continued below ground. My grandmother said the tunnels were built using child labor from their facilities. Hundreds of victims who were never reported missing because they were taken from other fake institutions. The tunnels connected orphanages, hospitals, government buildings, even churches. She said by 1953, they had over 2,000 people living in those tunnels, not just victims, but entire families who had been underground for generations. The three women in the photograph weren't worried about being caught. They were worried about losing control of their underground empire. If there are still thousands of people living in tunnels beneath our cities, people who have been underground for generations and know every secret about the St. Catherine's network, what happens when they finally decide to emerge and reclaim the surface world their ancestors were stolen from? But as Esperanza's eyes began to close for what investigators assumed would be the final time, she suddenly gripped the bed rail with impossible strength for someone so frail. She said the tunnel families weren't just victims who had been underground for generations. They were the original families who built St. Catherine's House of Mercy. My grandmother told me that in 1894 there was no investigation into missing people. The families who came looking for their children weren't searching for victims. She said the surface world had it backwards from the very beginning. St. Catherine's wasn't a place where people were taken to disappear. Here's the bombshell that destroys everything we thought we knew. The desperate families who sent their children to St. Catherine's House of Mercy weren't poor surface dwellers seeking help. They were tunnel families whose children had tried to escape to the surface world. The three fake nuns weren't predators hunting victims. They were enforcers dragging runaways back to their underground prison. My grandmother said Clara Whitmore wasn't a seamstress from Chicago. She was a tunnel-born girl who had made it to the surface and built a life in the daylight. The woman who took her identity wasn't stealing it to hide from the law. She told me that every investigation, every survivor story, every sealed archive was created by tunnel families who had successfully escaped underground. The real horror isn't that thousands of people are trapped in tunnels beneath our cities. If the people running our government, our schools, our hospitals are actually tunnel-born infiltrators who have been systematically taking control of the surface world for generations, how many of our leaders are working to expand the underground empire rather than protect us from it? But as investigators prepared to leave what they thought was their final interview, Esperanza's monitor began beeping frantically. The 94-year-old woman who had seemed moments from death suddenly sat up in bed with eyes wide open, staring directly at the lead investigator. "You," she whispered, pointing a trembling finger. "My grandmother described you perfectly." The investigator stepped back, confused. He had never been to Brazil before, had never heard of Esperanza Silva until 3 days ago, had never investigated anything connected to St. Catherine's House of Mercy until this case landed on his desk. "She said you would deny it, of course. She said you wouldn't even remember who you really are. My grandmother kept a photograph of you from 1953. You were just a child then, maybe 8 years old, standing with Mrs. Davies outside the children's charity. Here's the bombshell that destroys everything. The investigators searching for the truth about St. Catherine's House of Mercy aren't independent law enforcement officers. They're the conditioned children from the 1950s, now adults in positions of authority, programmed to investigate themselves in endless circles while never finding the real answers. She said you would feel drawn to this case without understanding why. My grandmother told me that the tunnel families don't need to infiltrate the surface world's institutions. She said the real St. Catherine's House of Mercy was never about creating victims. If the people investigating St. Catherine's House of Mercy are actually the missing children from 70 years ago, and if they're now training the next generation of investigators in the same endless cycle, how many other cold cases are actually the conditioned victims investigating their own childhood trauma without ever realizing it? As the investigator stared at the faded photograph of himself as a child, Esperanza's breathing suddenly became steady and strong. The dying woman, who had seemed moments from death, was now sitting upright, her eyes sharp and calculating. She said, her voice losing all trace of frailty, "My grandmother didn't just recognize Mrs. Davies from their work together. She recognized her because the woman who spent decades running the children's charity, selecting victims, training replacements, she was born in those tunnels in 1889. But here's what my grandmother discovered that terrified her more than anything else. Mrs. Davies wasn't just her daughter. Here's the bombshell that shatters everything. The tunnel families don't just send their children to infiltrate the surface world, they send them to replace their own parents. Each generation is programmed to eliminate the previous generation once they've learned everything they need to know. The endless cycle isn't about expanding the operation, it's about perfecting it, by removing anyone who remembers how it all began. My grandmother said she finally understood why she had to die in 1978. It wasn't because she knew too much about St. Catherine's. The investigator standing in front of me right now, he's not just a conditioned victim from the 1950s. He's the son of one of the 3 women in that photograph. If the investigators searching for St. Catherine's House of Mercy are actually the children of the operators, programmed to eliminate their own parents when the time comes, how many other missing persons cases are actually just the tunnel families cleaning house while the surface world mistakes it for serial killers? But as the investigator stared at his own childhood photograph, Esperanza's hospital gown fell open slightly, revealing something that made his blood freeze. Carved into her chest, barely visible above her heart, was a small scar in the shape of a cross, the same scar he had carried his entire life, the same scar every investigator on his team had in the exact same location. "My grandmother told me you would all have the mark," Esperanza whispered, her eyes now completely lucid. "But she also told me something else about that mark. She said the mark wasn't just a way to identify tunnel children, it was a tracking device. Here's the bombshell that destroys everything. The investigators aren't just conditioned victims or programmed children. They're active transmitters, broadcasting every piece of evidence they discover directly back to the tunnel families. Every interview, every breakthrough, every sealed document they've accessed has been immediately reported to the very people they think they're hunting. My grandmother said you would eventually trace the investigation back to this room, to this conversation, to me. But she also said that the moment you found me, the moment you heard my story, the tunnel families would know their surface operation had been compromised. She told me that within 24 hours of our conversation, every investigator with the mark would receive new orders. If the investigators searching for St. Catherine's House of Mercy are actually sleeper agents programmed to kill anyone who gets too close to the truth, and if they're about to receive their activation orders, how many other people in this nursing home are about to become the next victims of the very case they thought they were trying to solve? As the investigator reached instinctively for the scar on his chest, Esperanza's laughter filled the room with a sound that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than her frail body should have allowed. She wheezed, her eyes now gleaming with something that looked almost like pity. "My grandmother told me you would all reach for it the moment I mentioned it." The investigator's hand froze over his chest as Esperanza continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Here's the bombshell that destroys everything. Those scars aren't tracking devices or identification marks. They're entry wounds. Each investigator on the team died as children in those tunnels 70 years ago. The cross-shaped scars mark where metal stakes were driven through their hearts during the ritual killings that were supposed to keep them dead. My grandmother said the tunnel families discovered something in 1953 that changed everything about their operation. They learned that the children who died in their ceremonies didn't stay dead. She told me that every investigator with the mark is actually a 70-year-old corpse walking around in a body that stopped aging the day they died. But here's what terrifies even the tunnel families about what they created. My grandmother said the dead children are starting to remember not their surface lives, not their families, but their deaths. If the investigators searching for St. Catherine's House of Mercy are actually the reanimated corpses of murdered children, and if they're starting to remember who killed them, what happens when they realize the tunnel families they've been protecting are the same people whose hands drove stakes through their hearts 70 years ago? But as the investigator stared at the scar on his chest, Esperanza's breathing suddenly changed from labored gasps to something that sounded almost like suppressed laughter. The dying woman, who had seemed moments from her final breath, was now looking at him with eyes that held decades of carefully guarded secrets. She whispered, her voice gaining strength. She wasn't documenting the crimes. My grandmother told me that the tunnel families didn't just discover how to bring dead children back to life. They discovered something far more valuable. She said the investigators with the cross scars don't just solve cold cases. They solve impossible cases. Cases that should have no evidence, no witnesses, no leads. Here's the bombshell that changes everything. St. Catherine's House of Mercy was never about creating victims or operators or even reanimated investigators. It was about creating the perfect crime-solving force. The tunnel families have been deliberately murdering children and bringing them back to life for over a century, then placing them in law enforcement positions to solve crimes that protect the underground network from exposure. My grandmother said every major criminal investigation in the past 70 years has been solved by teams of dead children walking around in adult bodies, but she also told me something that made her finally understand why she had to die in 1978. The dead children weren't just solving random crimes. If the justice system itself has been controlled by reanimated murder victims for 70 years, and if every crime they've solved has been carefully selected to protect their own killers, how many innocent people are sitting in prison while the real criminals continue their work in the tunnels beneath our feet? As the investigators stared at the scar on his chest, trying to process the impossible reality of his own death and resurrection, Esperanza's eyes suddenly widened with a terror that seemed to come from a memory she had tried to suppress for decades. "Wait," she gasped, her voice cracking with fear. "There's something else my grandmother told me about those dead children." She said in 1978, right before she died, she discovered that the reanimated children weren't solving crimes to protect the tunnel network. Every case file, every investigation, every seemingly random criminal they caught, it was all creating a detailed blueprint of the tunnel system. The dead children's supernatural abilities weren't being used to find evidence. They were being used to locate every entrance, every exit, every weak point in the underground empire. My grandmother said the tunnel families made one fatal mistake when they brought those children back to life. They assumed the dead would remain loyal to their killers. The reanimated investigators weren't just regaining their memories of being murdered. They were coordinating with each other, planning something. Here's the bombshell that destroys everything. The dead children have been pretending to work for the tunnel families for 70 years while actually preparing for a massive coordinated attack. Every crime they've solved has given them more access to weapons, more connections to law enforcement, more control over the surface world's security systems. My grandmother said she found evidence that the dead children had been recruiting, not just other reanimated victims, but living people who had lost children to the tunnels. But here's what made her finally understand why she had to die. The dead children weren't just planning to attack the tunnel families. If the reanimated investigators are about to destroy the underground network and every surface structure connected to it, how many major cities are about to be reduced to rubble by an army of dead children seeking revenge for their own murders? But as the investigators' team prepared to evacuate the nursing home, Esperanza's frail hand suddenly shot out and grabbed his wrist with impossible strength. Her eyes, which had been clouded with age moments before, now burned with a clarity that seemed to see straight through him. "My grandmother lied about one thing," she whispered, her voice cutting through the chaos of alarms and shouting voices. "But 3 days ago, I received a visitor, a woman who looked exactly like my grandmother did in 1953. She said the dead children never wanted revenge against the tunnel families. They wanted to join them. Here's the bombshell that destroys everything. The reanimated investigators aren't planning to destroy the tunnel network. They're planning to take it over. Every crime they've solved, every connection they've made, every weapon they've stockpiled, it's all been preparation for a coup that will put the dead children in control of both the surface world and the underground empire. My grandmother said the tunnel families created their own replacements when they brought those children back to life. But she didn't realize the dead children were smarter than their killers. The woman who visited me 3 days ago told me something that made me understand why I was really kept alive all these years. She told me that every person who has investigated St. Catherine's House of Mercy over the past century, every reporter, every detective, every government official, their names are all on a list. If the reanimated investigators are about to seize control of both worlds and eliminate everyone who has ever investigated their case, how many people are about to discover that searching for the truth about St. Catherine's House of Mercy was actually signing their own death warrant? The investigator's hand trembled as he reached for his service weapon, muscle memory kicking in despite the impossible revelation about his own death. But as his fingers closed around the grip, Esperanza's laughter stopped abruptly. "You still don't understand," she said, her voice now carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I'm not Esperanza Silva." The woman who had seemed moments from death sat up fully in bed, her frail appearance melting away like a discarded mask. Her eyes were clear, her voice strong, her movements fluid and purposeful. I'm Clara Whitmore, the real Clara Whitmore. The investigators' world tilted. Everything they thought they knew, every twist in the story, every revelation about tunnels and reanimated children and stolen identities, it all crumbled in an instant. There are no tunnel families, Clara continued, her voice gentle but firm. There are no reanimated children. There's just St. Catherine's House of Mercy. 1 building, 3 women, 67 victims. The investigator sank into a chair, his mind reeling. But the scars, the photographs, I created them all, Clara said simply. Every story, every piece of evidence, every witness. I was 19 when I escaped that house. I told the sheriff exactly what happened. 3 women tortured and killed innocent people for money. That's it. No grand conspiracy. No supernatural elements. She pulled out a worn leather journal from beneath her pillow. This contains the real testimony, the one I've been trying to get someone to read for over a century. Names, dates, methods. But they buried it, called me hysterical, said a young woman couldn't possibly understand what she had witnessed. So I spent my life creating stories they would investigate. The investigator looked at his team, all of them bearing the same expression of confusion and disbelief, makeup and prosthetics. I needed you to believe you were connected to the case. But why? Clara's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion the investigator had seen from her. Because they're still out there, not in tunnels or underground networks, in plain sight. The descendants of those 3 women have been running similar operations for generations. Small scale, careful. She handed him the journal. 16 facilities across 7 states, operating right now, taking society's most vulnerable people and making them disappear. The real St. Catherine's House of Mercy never ended. I tried telling the truth for 50 years. No one listened. The investigator opened the journal. Names, addresses, financial records, victim lists, real evidence, solid leads, everything they needed to shut down the actual operations. Every wild story I told you contains a grain of truth, buried inside. The charity organizations, the government connections, the systematic targeting of vulnerable people. Clara stood up. Her movements, those of a woman who had carried an impossible burden for too long. The elaborate tales end here. The real investigation begins now. Don't let my lifetime of deception be for nothing. Find them. Save them. As Clara walked toward the door, she paused. And investigator, your scar isn't from a supernatural resurrection. It's from the heart surgery you had as a child. I researched all of you carefully before creating this final story. The door closed behind her, leaving the team alone with the truth they had been searching for all along. This is the moment you've been waiting for. You absolutely need to subscribe to this channel right now, because this is exactly the kind of exclusive content that only true mystery hunters get to experience. Don't wait another second. Hit that subscribe button immediately. Mash that like button now and feed the algorithm so we can bring you more incredible stories like this one. This is the moment to show your support for the channel that brings you the truth others won't dare to tell. Flood the comments section with your reactions. Tell us what you think about Clara's final revelation. Share your theories about which part of her story was real and which was deception. Only true fans understand how important your engagement is to keeping these stories alive. Share this video instantly with at least 5 friends who need to know how this incredible case finally ended. Don't let them miss out on the most shocking conclusion we've ever revealed. You need to spread this story before it gets buried again. This is your chance to be part of the community that refuses to let the truth stay hidden. Subscribe now, like now, comment now, and share now. True mystery hunters don't wait. They act.